As you can already tell, this video is going to be fundamentally different. I'm going to kind of do a voiceover for the slideshow presentation on James, entitled James in Postcolonial Perspective, the Letter of as Nativist Discourse. Now, that is the title of my book that you'll do a lot of reading out of this week and next, and maybe for the next couple of weeks, because I think James is important to early Christianity, and I think the debate between James and Paul is one of the earliest debates in this early Jesus movement. I don't think Christianity proper has even formed while these guys are in a tangle. So I'll talk about James in this presentation, a little bit about Paul because I think they imply each other, but I'll also introduce you to postcolonial theory, postcolonial biblical criticism, as a way to engage a text, kind of a modern form of biblical interpretation. And postcolonial theory was developed a while back by a guy named Edward Said, Hamid Baba, and a woman named Gayatri Spivak. Their theory is placed within cultural theory, but it really has kind of been a big influence in biblical studies. So, and I'm one of those practitioners. A couple of folks at ITC are as well. It's important, I think. So let's look at the letter of James. First, I think the letter of James is a nativist reaction to Roman imperialism and Pauline hybridity. So the letter of James has two opponents, really. It is combating Roman imperialism and Pauline hybridity. And this, when I say hybridity, these are postcolonial terms. I understand Paul as a colonial or postcolonial hybrid, where he is he uses Roman imperialism to his sometimes, and sometimes he doesn't. So he's kind of in this in-between place between Judaism proper and Gentile-ish or Gentile-ishly living. So I think James really kind of refutes that in a nativist way. So let's talk a little bit about nativism. Nativist identity is essentialist identity, and an example of it is negritude. Here you have a piece of the front cover of L'Étudiant Noir. This is a journal that was published in the 30s by a guy named Aimé Césaire and a couple of his colleagues. Aimé Césaire was a black Martinican from the Caribbean. They speak French there because it was a French outpost and continues to be, really. And he went to Paris to study. As a black Caribbean in Paris, his blackness really kind of grounded his identity. And negritude is a French word meaning blackness. And he's the first one to coin the term negritude. And it's this essentialist black identity that kind of formed Césaire and his friends. So Léopold Sénior was one of his colleagues there in Paris. Léopold Sénior went on to be the president of Senegal and led Senegal to independence from France. So this is an incredibly important movement, but they came down to this, what is our identity that shapes us and molds us and brings us into solidarity? And for these young men and women in Paris in the 30s who were black and from Africa and the Caribbean, their concept of blackness, negritude, became their identity that grounded them. And that is a nativist move, this idea that there's this essentialist identity that is at the core of your being and that you share with others. That, I think, is kind of the root of nativist identity. And I think James is espousing a form of nativism throughout his letter. And you'll see that in this James 1:27, which is a theme passage for the whole letter. Religion or piety, maybe, that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this. And of course, you probably already know that that is to take care of the widow and orphan in their distress and to remain unstained by the world. So for James is constructing a pure, undefiled, unstained identity. And that pure and undefiled, unstained identity is very Jewish. He's certainly a Jesus follower. He's the brother of Jesus. We'll talk about that later. But this idea of purity and undefiledness is a nativist construction of identity. The idea that there's this pure identity that he goes to. And that pure identity for James puts him against Roman imperialism. And here you have some kind of major passages that are anti-Roman from James 2:5. Has God not chosen the poor in the world? This section, James 1 through 2, chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, is a major passage for James. It is the first large section of the body of the letter, and there he kind of attacks Roman imperialism with their partiality to the wealthy. And he actually talks about somebody in a gold ring. Gold rings were exclusively used by the most elite in Roman society, the senatorial and equestrian rank. So this idea that God has chosen the poor is turning Roman imperialism upside down. Again, you get this wisdom from above versus wisdom that is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. That is, I think, anti-Roman. And then finally, James 5, 1 through 6 is an utter condemnation of wealth and the wealthy. Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. In all of these major sections of James really kind of leans into Roman imperialism and attacks it without calling it Roman imperialism. He attacks the major structures of that culture. The patronage movement, which is when wealthy people took care of poor people. He did not like that, and that idea was attacked in James 1 through 13. Wisdom from above versus wisdom below, and then the way wealthy landowners exploited their laborers and didn't pay them the wages that they were worth in 5, 1 through 6 are all anti-Roman passages. And the anti-Roman over against a nativist pure identity that James is constructing. So you get these two poles, this nativism of James versus Roman imperialism. And if you're that adamant against imperialism, you're drawing a strong line between James is drawing a strong line between this pure identity he has and Roman imperialism. So the worst thing that James can conceive of is someone crossing that border that he's constructing, or not paying attention to those boundaries. And I think this is where James has the biggest problem with Paul, because I think James understands Paul as blurring that boundary that James is constructing. So this is where he takes on Paul in chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. Can faith save you? Paul absolutely says faith alone saves you. And then in James 2:14, James asks this rhetorical question: can faith alone save you? And the answer for James is no. It takes other things. It takes works. And then in chapter 3, from the same mouth come blessing and curses, my brothers, this ought not be. James 4, 1 through 12 is probably the most vitriolic passage in James, that he's attacking people who would transgress these boundaries. And he calls them whores, which is really aggressive language. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? So he lifts up the binary, this polarization between pure identity with James versus corrupt identity with Rome, and you can't have both of those. This is his major argument against Paul. So finally you get there, you boast in your arrogance, all such boasting is evil. The word boast there is found in a lot of Paul's writings, almost Pauline if you look in the New Testament. So I think James is anti-Roman, but also anti-Pauline hybridity. So that concept that Paul has in 1 Corinthians, to a Jew I become a Jew to win some Jews, to those living outside the law I become as one living outside the law to win some. that would be utterly disgraceful to James. He doesn't think you can do that. So James is both anti-Roman and anti-Pauline hybridity. So let's look at the letter of James as a structure, as a unit. We'll talk about authorship, date and provenance. Here you got a piece of the Codex Sinaiticus of James. That's in Greek. It's the earliest full Bible that we have. I think I've already mentioned that in some previous lectures. But look at authorship. Who is this James? There are three main Jameses in the New Testament. James, the brother of John, son of Zebedee. This guy is mentioned quite a bit. John is the more famous brother. These are the brothers of thunder. These are the two that Jesus calls to be disciples. The problem with this James is that King Herod had James killed in Acts chapter 12 and following. So it can't be this James because he's killed early, and not long after that we hear about another James. There's a James, the lesser James, the son of Alphaeus, is barely mentioned, but he is mentioned as one of the 12 disciples. So those two are unlikely candidates. But James of Jerusalem, the brother of the Lord, this is our main candidate. And it's mainly because of Paul. In Galatians, Paul mentions James as the brother of the Lord in Galatians 1:19, 2:9, and 2:12. He again mentions him in 1 Corinthians 15:17. And the way Paul talks about him, he seems to be the main leader in this early Jesus movement from Jerusalem. And then Acts corroborates that in chapter 12, 15, 21, where James seems to be a major player, the leader of this early Jesus movement. Jude 1 is another area. And then Josephus is important, this early Jewish writer, because he basically narrates the death of James in around 62 of the Common Era. So we believe that James of Jerusalem, the Lord's brother, is the one who wrote this. It's a cumulative effect of reasons rather than any single one. The greeting in 1:1 lacks any attempt to expound exactly who James is. So whoever's writing this letter assumes that everybody knows who he is. And someone who would write like that would have to have some kind of authority. So it does look like this is the James, the leader of the Jesus tradition. The way Jesus is never quoted, James never quotes Jesus, but there is Jesus tradition used. And that tradition later becomes quotations of Jesus in the Gospels that were written decades later. So we think that the way the Jesus tradition is used is an early stage of usage that would date this letter very early. And also it's lacking anything particularly Christian. Jesus is mentioned twice in chapter 1, verse 1 and chapter 2, verse 1, but it doesn't say much about Jesus. And then the teaching inside it isn't anything specifically Christian. So it looks like a very Jewish document, which would mean that it's probably very early. And linguistically, it's very close to Paul, which is another early Christian writer. So we think it's written by James, and it's written early. James was stoned to death by Ananus, who was a high priest of Jerusalem. According to Josephus, this would have dated his death to about 62. Paul's letter to the Galatians is written about 48 to 45, and Paul's initial encounter with James, according to Galatians, according to Paul's own words, was around 40. So we know that the letter of James was probably written between 40, where Paul and James meet each other, and 62, where James dies, because I do think he's engaging Paul. So James wrote it. It's written early. And, from where was it written? It was most likely written from Jerusalem. At the very beginning, James 1:1, the letter is written to the diaspora, those dispersed out there. In other passages, we hear that James is the leader in Jerusalem, and so this is a diaspora briefe in the German word. It means it's a letter to the diaspora, written from the center of Jerusalem. So we think it's written by James, it's written early, and it's from Jerusalem. So let's talk about postcolonial biblical criticism. There are three major forms. The first one is a liberation or contextual or vernacular hermeneutics. This is using postcolonial theory to read the Bible for liberation. The other one is X and Empire. This basically only pays attention to the Roman Empire and the New Testament, and is very historical. And then there's this extra biblical postcolonial studies that uses kind of dense postcolonial theory to read the text, not so much for liberation, but really kind of break the text apart in this deconstructive mode. But here you have R.S. Sugatharaja. He's a famous New Testament scholar and postcolonial theorist. And here, this quote I think is indicative of this way of reading. What postcolonial biblical criticism does is to focus on the whole issue of expansion, domination, and imperialism as central forces in defining both the biblical narratives and biblical interpretation. Postcolonialism's ongoing battle for emancipation and continuing attempt to dismantle imperial institutions and dominating structures offers a valuable field for collaboration. So that's how he reads. That's how he does postcolonial biblical criticism for liberation. The other is X and Empire, and this pays close attention to the Roman Empire and its effects on the cultural assumptions of the biblical writers. The Roman Empire is the main lens through which the biblical texts are interpreted, and Warren Carter, Richard Horsley are pretty famous for this kind of reading, but it doesn't do much for like modern day questions. It's still a very historical reading of the text in the first century. And it doesn't ask emancipatory questions for modernity like Sugatharaja. And then finally, this other mode of discourse, which is, I'm somewhere between this extra-biblical postcolonial studies and the more liberation-oriented readings. That's where my work comes on the letter of James. But this uses the kind of dense postcolonial theory as a primary lens to read Scripture. And so Moore wants to replicate the strategy of deploying a deconstructive sensibility to tease out the tortuous complexities and contradictions of life under colonialism and imperialism. So instead of reading the text only for liberation, he reads the text and shows, okay, this is where it's liberative, but this is also where the text begins to mimic Roman imperialism. In other words, it's just a divine imperialism. So he kind of teases it out. He doesn't show only the good parts of the text. He really does a good job of showing how imperialism is deeply embedded to the text itself. So as you read through the letter of James this week, this is how I divide the structure of James, or see the major divisions within it. You get the major greeting, which is very important. It is a table of contents that has it's a twofold table of contents that goes from 2 through 25 in chapter 1, and then you get the major theme verses in 26 and 27. Chapter 2 all the way to chapter 5 verse 6 is the main body of the letter, and it fluctuates between being anti-Roman and Pauline hybridity. So partiality in 2:1 through 13 is anti-Roman. The faith works binary and the taming of the hybrid tongue are both anti-Paul. Wisdom two ways is anti-Roman. The dipsokos dichotomy and the road to conflict are anti-Paul, and the condemnation of the wealthy is anti-Roman. So it goes back and forth between anti-hybrid, anti-Roman stuff. Now, if you got a question about the dipsokos dichotomy, that's okay. Because that is the dipsokos is a Greek word, mostly translated as double-minded. I translate it as two-faced. I think that kind of captures exactly what we're trying to get at. So that is the video lecture this week. Read through the letter of James. You can also read Ehrman's work on James. I kind of disagree with him on quite a bit of this. He thinks James is late. I think it's early. But that's how I situate the letter of James, and I hope you enjoy reading the text and the extra readings.